PyQt directory, let's move this over, is you see that in addition to having this asset importer window, I've moved the rest of the code into this UI subdirectory. It's a package, and we have the UI file, but we also have a Python version of the UI file. And I'll explain how you do that, but let's take a look at the asset browser for a moment. And let's open up the script editor and make sure our code is on the path as usual. And we're going to do a little bit of a longer import statement. We're going to say from asset importer PyQt, which is our package level directories, import asset importer win, which is our PyQt version of this module, as asset PyQt. That would avoid any name clashes if you were importing before. We're just going to give it a different name when it comes in. So we're going to run that, and then we're going to run the show command. And as you can see, it looks very similar, but I've done a few extra changes. I have added a show drop-down, and I've also used a splitter, which is something that I could do in PyQt really easily, to split the windows like this. You get a lot more control, and I use these group containers, as you can see with the titles. And now it was much easier to lay this out and have control over it, so I can just refresh the library, and I see everything. And if I use the show drop-down, when I switch that, I get a filtering. So now you can see how you can actually add filtering, and this is with when you change this, it fires a signal that hits a change routine, and it shows all of them, and it works just as expected. There you go. So and you can see this is a different title, PyQt. So let's go ahead and close this, and let's take a look at what's different in the code. Okay, so I was talking about how I moved everything into this UI directory. And instead of using this UI file, and actually I'm going to open that up and open recent, and let's make this a little smaller. Now everything is still pretty much the same, except for adding the splitter and adding this drop down and giving that a name called showbox and putting these in groups. So I saved this file just like normal. But instead of using it directly, what we do is we can convert it into a Python module, and it looks like this, and you don't even have to mess with any of this. This is the entire layout in Python, but it's auto-generated for us. And the way I did that is if I bring up a shell, and again, this is somewhat unique to maybe your system if you're on Windows or Mac or Linux, but the common command that comes with installing PyQt is pyuic4. Now, because it's installed into Maya, it's a little bit more difficult to get to. You have to have it on your path. If you're using my OS X installer, I've created a convenience one called myuic. And the way that works is it just takes where you want to save it to. And let me bring up my Finder. So I can say that I want to save it to, that's my output file, and then I have to give it my input file. And if I hit enter, it makes me this Python, which wouldn't have existed before, but now it's created. And if we go back to the code here, we don't need this. And let's open up our asset importer. Let's take a look what's different. So I'm using a slightly modified asset importer 4, which is the 4th version. The last time in the Qt module we were using the 3, and I'll take a look at this in a second. And now what's different is I'm importing two PyQt modules from PyQt, which now exists because it's installed in Maya, Qt Core and PyQt, Qt GUI. These are two things that are pretty common to use. And then from my UI package that I moved everything into, I'm importing asset importer UI, and this is actually inside, that's a class that's inside here. And then I have this flow layout that I'm importing, and this is another example of how you can grab stuff off the internet. This was actually included in the PyQt examples So I just grabbed this out of the examples and included it here. It's a different type of layout. We were using a grid layout before, and now I have this flow layout, which is going to do a lot more nice work for me, and I'll show you what that does momentarily. And then we have these two utility functions, and this is kind of a little helper tool when you're using PyQt. So I import from the API this, it's a UI helper, and then we need this module called SIP, which also comes with the PyQt installation. And I'll explain that in a moment as well. Then what I do is, when you create a PyQt application, you can only have one in an application, and because an application exists in the Qt of Maya itself, what we do is we set this global and we just grab the instance. So if you had 5 of these different types of PyQt scripts, you would always just use the same instance. You don't want to create a new one. Normally in PyQt you would create a new application, but this is how we just share this global reference amongst the various applications that we install. And so let's go through this part of the code. Here's our same class, asset importer win, but now we're inheriting from two things. We're doing multiple inheritance. Number one, we're saying that this is a QDialog, which is the basic type of dialog in Qt. And then we're also inheriting from our UI file. And this would be as opposed to loading it in manually from the file. And then we have our init, and we call the superclass init just like we have done before. This is not changed. None of this has changed. Now here is something new. When you inherit from the UI file that you created, you get this setup UI, and all you have to do is call setup UI, and it completely sets up with all the widgets that were created. And from that point, I have access to all the widgets. Here's where I have access to the splitter that I created, and I have access to that because if I open up Qt, and you see I created a splitter called splitter, and it comes in as splitter. I just have access to it like an object, much better than having to access it with Maya's UI commands. Here's how we create the library layout, and if you remember before, it was a grid layout, but now we're using that flow layout that we imported, and we're saying it's parented to the scroll window. And the cool thing about the flow layout, if I bring up the script editor again, and let's bring this up and refresh. Now watch what happens to the layout of these icons as I make the window smaller. They automatically reflow. That's not something you get with the Maya layout as far as I'm aware of with the grid layout. You have to specify how many columns, but this flow layout automatically recalculates the row column configuration, which is really great. So that's another cool thing about PyQt. And then we go down here and we created our show box, which was the combo box, and all I do is I clear it. I add that blank item, if you remember first. I should really leave this up so we can keep referencing it. Yeah, I'll leave it up. So you see how there's a blank one first. That means show all. So we add that first, and then we list shows, and this is something that we added to the new importer when I said I made a version 4. We say for show in the importer list shows, and we add each show to the show box. And if I open up asset importer 4 and I look down here, I have a new method that I wrote called list shows, and all this does is go into the root directory of the asset location, and it finds each show path and it adds it to a list of shows, and then it returns it. So this basically just gives me a list of all the shows under my asset root location. So that's how we generate the list for the box. Now this is a new concept in PyQt. In the Qt we used commands, and we had to edit the button and say command equals a reference. Now the way you do it in PyQt is you have these things called signals and slots. Every widget has signals that it emits under certain actions, and buttons have a clicked signal. So what you do is you say from this reload button, clicked, connect it to refresh assets, which for the most part has not changed, just one or two things. Same with the other button, connected to refresh imported. The imported list has an item clicked, which is very similar to the other import list that we had. And now we have this show box, which has a every time a current index in the box is changed, connect it to this new one called refresh assets, which actually is the same thing but with some more arguments. So now we have refresh assets, and the only couple things different in here is the different way we clear out the library, which is this right here, how this gets cleared every time this needs to refresh. And the way we clear that is we just say while it's not empty, we loop over the library and we take out the first index and we destroy it. That clears out the box. And then we get the current show that's set in the show box. And if it's set to something, then we set our importer. You remember how we can set the importer show so that it's working on that show. And we set all shows to false. Otherwise, all shows is true. That's how we get, that would be all shows in the importer. That would be the general show, and then the war show. And now down here, we just loop over the importer list. This is exactly the same as the last Qt example in Asset Importer 3. We just say all shows equals whether it's true or false. So this would either give us all shows or the current set show. Same idea here. We create a callback using the partial, and we say load asset, and we set. Now this is kind of a new item here. These are no longer icon text items from Maya. These are a widget that we've created. And what I'm saying is I'm going to get the asset, and I'm going to create this new type of widget. And I'll show you what that is. But we create this widget. We set the text for the widget to be the name in the show. This is similar to the last one as well. And then we create a connection on the fly. Each one of these items has a button that can have the clicked connect command. So every time one of these is clicked, it fires off this command, which is set right here, which means load that asset. And then we just add the widget to the library layout. Let me jump down here because we're talking about it and show you this asset item. What I did here is I created a new kind of QWidget. And a QWidget is pretty much any visual object you see in the visual interface. So I create a new asset item. I give it all these defaults, like it needs the text, the image path, and then I set up. This is how I'm manually creating a widget without the Qt Designer. I give it a vertical layout. I add a push button and a label, and then I add them to the layout. That's how you see this push button label in a vertical layout. And then I say if the text was passed in, set the text. If the image path was set in, set the image path. If there's a size, set the size. Otherwise, there's the default icon size. And I just have these convenience methods of how to set the text, how to set the image path. And to set the image path, the button has a set icon method. This is a button with a set icon method. Oops, let me go back here. And you have to basically take the path and convert it into what's called a Q icon, and then you set the icon. And here's how you set the fixed size for the button. So each one of these items represents one of those buttons. And if we jump back up here, you see that I create a new widget and add the widget. So down here under refresh imported, this is very similar as well to the rest, except we just have a way to clear the list really fast. And we just loop over find imported. And now we have what's called a Q list widget item. So instead of just adding text to the list like in the Maya UI, you have to actually create these items which actually hold more information. It's really nice because you can store more stuff, which each one of those besides just text. So I create a new one of these items. I set the text to be the name of the widget, or of the imported path, actually, my mistake, the imported path. And then now this is an example of how you can set a new attribute on the fly. This doesn't have an asset attribute, but it gives me the flexibility to just say .asset equals the actual asset object that we created. So it keeps a reference to this asset item. It's really cool because when I go to get one of these back, I already have the asset item. I don't have to look anything up. And then I add that asset item to the list. So basically, every time I click on one of these, it returns me that list item, and I can just directly access the asset that's associated with it. And then this is the import item selected, which is the same from last time, except a couple small things. The item that comes in, we get the text of the item, which is in this case, a QListWidget item. So when that fires, instead of sending us the text, it sends us the ListWidget item that we set up. We grab the text out of it. If it exists in the scene, we select it. So this part is not different. And now this is the toHelper. You remember this is the helper function for showing, and these are slightly different. I'll show you why. Now, you create the instance to the window, but you have to say the parent equals this getMayaWindow function. Before it was simply just like that. But because this is a PyQt widget, we want to make sure that this window is parented to the Maya window. And you can see that it's on top and it comes up centered. If you don't parent it to the Maya window, it comes up anywhere off the screen and not parented to this master window. It doesn't see any kind of association between them. So you use this, my mistake here. We have this little convenience, which is also kind of a canned thing that you can keep reusing, where what it does is it uses the Python API, the MyaPython API, to get the main window reference, and then it uses this SIP module to wrap it into something that's an actual PyQt object. So that way we can just say get Maya window, this is an actual PyQt object, and then we show it. So that's the difference in those, and you can see that it's a lot cleaner to create it in Designer, convert it, and have access to all these. As you notice, I didn't have to use the delete me button to do any kind of workarounds, because we have object-oriented access to the splitter and creating a flow layout and the box. We don't have to find anything inside of Maya, and these signal slots are very powerful in just connecting all the various signals that get fired from these widgets to a handler. And that's pretty much it for PyQt. I apologize if this is kind of brief because I can't cover everyone's specific setup, but I want to hopefully make this as easy as possible to install. So look for the links in the package directory. I'm going to try and include a links of where you can, if you're on OS X or Windows, where you can download those. If you're on Linux, you can follow the instructions and hopefully get this PyQt set up for you. Alright, this concludes the second volume of the Python for Maya video. I know this was a lot of information, and my goal was to give you a ton of information in this video, and with the hopes that at any point you could go back and pause and look it over, and also that I've included a lot of documentation, notes, comments with all of these files that we talked about, so you can pause and read and see what's going on. So I just felt that it's better to give you more, and you can look at what I've given you and take a look for the links that I will include with the project. And again, if you ever have any comments or questions, feel free to email me, which will also be included. Thanks a lot.